Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with Lecture 3 of the Endocrine System. This is a short lecture just to talk about why blood glucose is so important and how it is regulated in terms of our metabolic processes. So blood glucose level is kept at a homeostatic level. The normal level for an adult is somewhere between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter in the fasting state. So that's the post-absorptive state between meals. Now this value that I've cited does vary depending on the source that you get the number from. But there is no doubt that normal blood glucose does spike after a meal, approximately 140 milligrams per deciliter. If you're on the low end of normal, maybe that's twice as much, but it won't last long. This is right after a meal. And your glucose level is controlled through metabolic processes in your body, metabolism. Also by hormones that are made by the pancreas and the adrenal gland, as well as your nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which we won't look at very much. So let's figure out why the body spends so much effort to keep blood glucose at a good level. First of all, the brain needs glucose. That's its main energy source, and it can't store glucose. So that means it needs blood. The blood that it receives needs to have glucose in it. It needs a continuous supply. Now the brain can use ketone bodies, but only during prolonged starvation. So in general, the brain needs glucose. Skeletal muscle also uses glucose for bursts of activity. The nice thing, though, about skeletal muscle is it can store glucose in the form of glycogen. So it does have a readily available source of glucose as long as it can break down glycogen and that it's received enough glucose in the past to even make the glycogen. Adipose tissue, of course, needs glucose to synthesize triglycerides. If nothing else, glucose is used to make the ATP that's necessary for the enzymatic reactions to make the triglycerides, but also excess glucose can actually be converted into triglycerides. The liver uses glucose to make fatty acids. A lot of the adipose or triglyceride synthesis that takes place throughout your body is actually assisted by the liver because the liver can make fatty acids, cholesterol, and bile salts. It makes bile, actually. The liver can also store glycogen and break down that glycogen into glucose, and the glucose can be sent into the bloodstream from the liver. That's different than skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle tissue, any glycogen that's broken down, the glucose has to be used by that tissue, by that cell. Kidney, the glucose is the exclusive energy source. It's definitely needed. And the heart, of course, can use fatty acids, and it does so regularly, but it can switch to glucose. So the heart, of course, is extremely important. So you're not going to be asked to memorize all those. What the main objective of this mini little lecture is for you to understand some terms. And these terms are glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogen synthesis, and glucose uptake. So these are all metabolic processes that can raise or lower blood glucose. And I want to make sure that you can use these terms pretty easily when we talk about hormones, because different hormones will do one of these things. So to raise blood glucose, we can break down glycogen. That's what glycogenolysis is. So glycogen lysis, breakdown of glycogen. And when glycogen is broken down or catabolized, that the product is glucose. This is performed by liver and skeletal muscle. So that's going to raise blood glucose, particularly when the liver does it, because the liver is going to, I guess, export the glucose into the bloodstream. Gluconeogenesis means to make new glucose from a different kind of molecule, from a non-carbohydrate, essentially. And the starting materials are usually amino acids, sometimes ketone bodies, and this can be performed by the liver and the kidney. So gluconeogenesis, making new glucose. Those are the two ways that we can raise blood glucose, other than just ingesting more nutrients, right? Okay, now lowering blood glucose, we can make glycogen, okay? But before the liver and the skeletal muscle can make glycogen, it has to have enough glucose. So cells have to take glucose up from the blood. We just call that glucose uptake. So glucose is transported from the bloodstream into cells. And in the liver and skeletal muscle, excess glucose can be turned into glycogen. Now, one process that's not on here is making fat. Adipose or adipocytes can import excess glucose and make lipids. So you have lipogenesis with the assistance of liver enzymes. But that's another thing. But these are the main ones that the hormones will act on. They'll either promote glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, or glycogen synthesis. So those terms are important. This is just sort of a picture that I tried to make for you to see if it would help you understand the concept of glucose metabolism. I'm not sure that it will, but we will try. We will see if it helps at all. Just want to use a thin, that's fine. Okay, so let's say that we have a normal level of blood glucose. Okay, and so we're in the blood right here. And the glucose is exported from the blood, so now it's in the extracellular fluid. And let's say it's taken up by a skeletal muscle cell. Now, if the glucose goes into skeletal muscle, it could just be used right away to make ATP, and then it's broken down and it's gone. But if there's excess glucose, the skeletal muscle cell can make glycogen. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry, a second. Okay, now it's going to go back down. Okay, good. The skeletal muscle cell can make glycogen from any extra glucose that it receives. That process is called glycogenesis. Now, let's say instead that the glucose that was taken up by the blood goes into the liver. So now it's going to go into a liver cell. The same thing can happen. So a liver cell can store glucose as glycogen. Let's say glucose goes into a kidney tubule cell. Again, the kidney can perform glycogenesis. It can store glucose. But if glucose goes into an adipocyte, usually it'll get converted into a fatty acid or triglyceride. So that will be lipogenesis. So that's what happens when glucose leaves the blood and it goes out to various different types of cells. Of course, always, if glucose is needed or energy source is needed to make ATP, that will happen first. So we're just talking about excess glucose. Now we're going to talk about what would happen if instead blood glucose was too low. Okay, so unfortunately, skeletal muscle can't do much about that. Okay, it does have this nice store of glycogen, so that minimally helps. That means at least not more glucose will be taken out of the blood. But this glycogen that's broken down into glucose has to be used locally. The liver can do something about it though. So let's say blood glucose is low. Now, the liver can respond to that because it's got this nice store of glycogen. And the enzymes that the cells contain will break down the glycogen, so that's glycogenolysis, and then export glucose out of their cells. And hopefully there's enough hormones around to get it into the bloodstream. So it's got to get into the bloodstream, but we're not going to get into transport mechanisms. So the liver breaks down glycogen to make glucose, and now it can go into the blood. Okay. Now let's look at see what can happen in adipocytes, fat, which has this plethora of fatty acids stored in triglycerides. The triglyceride can be broken down. The fatty acid that results can be broken down by beta oxidation. You might remember that. But nonetheless, the lipid's being broken down, so we'll just call it lipolysis. But what usually gets produced are these ketone bodies, not glucose directly. So from fatty acids, we get ketone bodies, which are acidic, and those are put into the blood. Now that's okay. For example, the brain can use some ketone bodies. Ketone bodies can be used, and some people try to induce this in their body because that's breaking down fat. But it does change the pH of your blood, so it's not ideal. Okay, that's from stores, right? Stores of energy. Now let's say instead we don't have much glycogen around anywhere. Well, skeletal muscle always has glycogen, but I'll erase that. Okay. So the liver doesn't have any glycogen. The kidney tubule, for some reason, no glycogen, which is rare. And there's very little fat around. Okay, that's probably not true either. But nonetheless, there are situations, prolonged starvation, skipping meals, for example, where the body can make carbohydrate, make glucose from non-carbohydrate stores. So the liver has amino acids and fatty acids present in its cells that it can convert into glucose. That process is called gluconeogenesis. So the extra glucose can be sent into the blood after it's been made. And kidney tubule cells can do that too, mainly when the kidney tubule cells run out of glucose and when ATP stores are low, we get a lot of production, and oxygen is low. We get a lot of production of lactate. This lactate can be converted into at least a carbohydrate energy source, and that's referred to as gluconeogenesis as well. So if I go back to the terminology again, this might make a little bit more sense to you. Sorry, just a second. When we break down glycogen, that's because the blood glucose has gotten too low and we need to raise it. The biggest organ, or the best organ, most frequently used, is the liver that does this. Also, if we don't have stored glycogen and we still need to raise the blood glucose because it's too low, we can make new glucose from amino acids and ketone bodies, lactate as well. This is primarily done by the liver, the kidney as well sometimes. Now, if we have high blood glucose and we need to lower it, that means we need to either, get rid of it in some way. And one way that the liver and the skeletal muscle get rid of it is by making glycogen. And not on this slide, adipose would make fat. Okay, you'd have triglyceride synthesis or lipogenesis. Now, for cells to actually use glucose, not all cells, but some cells, from the blood, so you have glucose really high floating around in the blood. For the cells to use the glucose, they need to take it up. And there are certain transporters that are needed for that. So even if we just increase epithelial cell, bone cell, increase their ability to take up the glucose out of the blood, that's going to lower blood glucose as well. Okay, so the next part of what we talk about in the endocrine system isn't all this metabolism stuff so much. It's hormones, right? So hormones that regulate blood glucose. And I'm sure you've heard of one, insulin. Okay, that's made by the pancreas and it's going to lower blood glucose. And the other one that the pancreas makes is glucagon. That's going to raise blood glucose. Now we will see later that insulin and glucagon will participate in some of those metabolic processes that I just talked about. Also raising blood glucose are two hormones made by the adrenal gland, and they also will participate in those metabolic processes. Okay, that's just an introduction to how blood glucose metabolism occurs, and the next lecture will deal with pancreatic hormones. Thank you.